Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for Ad Age's Town Hall exploring the LGBTQ plus experience in the ad world. I'm Janine Poggi, Assistant Managing Editor here at Ad Age, and I'm joined by my co-moderator for today, our agency reporter, Brian Bonilla. Hey, Brian.
Hey, Janine, and welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many of you out there, and thank you to all those who have already submitted questions. Today's conversation will include questions submitted by the audience, as well as Ad Age staffers. For those of you watching at home, feel free to post comments or additional questions on our social channels during the broadcast.
So despite nearly 15 million Americans identifying as LGBTQ+, it is still treated as a niche group by many marketers. While we have seen many high-profile brands double down on their commitments during Pride Month, it's what happens next that really matters. So this morning, we've brought together LGBTQ leaders from the brand, agency, tech, and media worlds. And over the next hour and a half, we'll hear from them and talk about how marketers can really extend their Pride campaigns throughout the year. We'll talk about some of the nuances to achieving successful representation and why brands should really look to shift ad dollars to LGBTQ-owned media companies. There's certainly a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started.
There certainly is. As the ad world has spent the last year scrambling to create a more diverse and inclusive culture, we're going to kick things off today by taking a look at where the LGBTQ plus community fits into the larger conversation and what Madison Avenue needs to do to better advocate for equality. To help answer these questions, we're joined by Mel Senecal, Director of Integrated Productions at Mojo Supermarket, Sarah Garman, Group Strategy Director at Droga 5, and Rich Ferraro, Chief Communications Officer at GLAAD, and also Executive Producer at the GLAAD Media Awards. Hey, everyone.
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get to some of the questions that were pre-submitted by our audience, I'd really like to start by taking a pulse of the landscape. We've seen the ad world rally behind the renewed, call for a social justice movement over the past year. How has the LGBTQ plus representation fit into those efforts being made by the ad world? Rich, maybe we could start with you for that.
Yeah. And thanks for hosting this discussion not in June, not during Pride Month, because when we talk about the state of LGBTQ inclusion in ads, it's almost like you have to talk about it on two tracks. One is during Pride Month, and one is 365 days a year. But guess what? LGBTQ people are here 365 days a year and should be included in that way. In terms of inclusion in advertising, I see us tracking behind other marginalized communities, and as this big reckoning is happening in the industry, we often see at GLAAD LGBTQ issues and people and representation is a bit left out of that conversation or a bit of an afterthought, except during June. And I talk about that in two ways. One is the stats. So in terms of ads that were submitted to Cannes Lions 2 years ago, less than 2% were LGBTQ inclusive. GLAAD tracks LGBTQ representation on television every year, and this year we found that nearly 10% of television shows are LGBTQ inclusive. So it's shocking to see that disconnect between our representation in advertising and then our representation on television. The good news on television, though, is that for the first time ever, more than half of the characters who are LGBTQ are people of color. So not only is TV representing us more, but they're also getting the intersectionality of the community right. And then anecdotally speaking, at GLAAD, our work at GLAAD is all around media advocacy, which often means behind the scenes consulting with television shows, video games, news and journalism, and then also advertising. And we worked with nearly 50 brands during Pride Month, whether that was behind the scenes consulting on campaigns to get that representation right, or front and center in public partnership on campaigns. So nearly 50 brands during the month of June. The month before that, I was thinking about this panel this morning, and I remember really only one brand that was working with us during the month of May. That was Jergens. They did an amazing Mother's Day campaign that included a trans mom and also 2 lesbian moms in this beautiful video that they put out of moms of all backgrounds. And at GLAD, the reason why we're focused on improving that number, the Cannes Lions number that I mentioned, and improving the level of representation, is that brands are trusted today. The Edelman Trust Barometer is something we often cite, and they found that brands are more trusted than government. So the Gen Pop, general public, is really looking to brands for education, and there's this huge opportunity as a media advocacy organization to get brands to present LGBTQ people and LGBTQ issues in the right way. We did a survey with Procter & Gamble that we released last year during the World Economic Forum in Davos, right before the pandemic, one of the last in-person events. And it was a standing room only event, which is rare at Davos because there's so much happening. But people were really interested to hear about our research at P&G that looked at the Gen Pop and how they were responding to inclusion in ads. And it was a really good story for GLAD to tell, because nearly 3/4 of respondents to our survey, non-LGBTQ people, said they're comfortable seeing us in ads. Very different than a few years ago and then 10 years ago. And the other big highlight was that nearly 70% were interested in patronizing and in buying products from a brand that included us. So they're comfortable seeing LGBTQ people in ads, and also they're more likely to favor brands that include us.
So what I'm hearing is GLAD is finding really over the past year that LGBTQ plus has not received the same attention other marginalized groups have over the past year.
Yeah, exactly. And we launched in May of this year with P&G a new program at GLAD called the Visibility Project that's going to be dedicated over the next 3 years to changing that, just like we've done in Hollywood and in news, to trying to advocate for more representation and giving advertisers tools to do that.
Well, great. This next question, I'd like to kick off to you, Sarah. What have you seen as it relates to the representation of the LGBTQ plus community inside marketing teams and ad agencies, and what work still needs to be done?
Are you asking specifically about internal teams?
Yes, yeah, internal push.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, I think I've seen many improvements in representation in internal teams. I think where work still needs to be done is in conversations and active allyship within our internal teams. I will say that I have very rarely been asked about my experience or my values or feelings as a queer person by straight people, and that's okay, but ask away. And I understand that's difficult sometimes. I think sometimes it feels as if when you're an ally, you have to almost have a degree in queer theory in order to engage in conversations or ask about the queer experience. I have even felt that myself. So I think that, for us as queer people, it's really important that, we trust the good intentions of friends, colleagues, and clients who are trying and who want to be active allies, and approach them with vulnerability and forgiveness, and really sort of, embrace rich dialogue about the queer experience. So that's what I'm hoping for more in the future.
An important element to inclusivity that often gets overlooked is intersectionality. Mel, can you talk about the nuances advertisers need to keep in mind when they're trying to reach and represent the LGBTQ plus community?
Of course. That's the beauty of intersectionality, right? Like, there's not a box that you have to check. There's not best practices. It's about really making sure that your agency and your brand is a truly inclusive environment, so that those conversations can actually happen, and you have creatives and teams that are intersectional, so that you can make true, honest creative that's not genuine and doesn't speak to the community in an honest way.
I'd like to chime in there as well, if that's okay. Look, we know that queer communities are not a monolith. I think as advertising to queer people has become more mainstream, there's also been sort of a growing laziness around how many brands do it, right? Instead of the subtext, that we used to see that at least demonstrated knowingness of queer communities and identities. Now, as we know, we see brands sort of just slap a pride flag on something or a rainbow on something. So I think that, within agencies and within our clients, there needs to be a concerted effort to move beyond the stereotypical tropes and really dig deeper into nuanced narratives that are going to better resonate with all queer identities. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. And, this next question comes actually from one of our readers. It often feels like the LG in LGBTQIP plus gets 90% of the attention, both in terms of media coverage, but also during Pride. How do we make sure to educate people on these groups, what issues they face, what they actually stand for, and show equal representation of these parts of the community? We can start with you, Rich, and anyone else can feel free to chime in.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about the full LGBTQ community, we just talked about intersectionality. It's so important to know and recognize that LGBTQ people are of all races. It's so important to recognize LGBTQ people of color, older LGBTQ people, queer people with disabilities, and especially trans and non-binary people. And that's where I think there's a huge opportunity for brands to help educate the public about who trans and non-binary people are. It's also an excellent way, when done authentically and when done well, to get earned media for campaigns as well. If we think back to last year, in 2020, the Super Bowl had a record number, Janine actually covered this story, but a record number of LGBTQ inclusive ads, one of them being TurboTax, which featured Isis King and Trace Lissette, amazing trans actresses and beloved trans icons today. And that campaign got a ton of earned media and kudos from the community, positive social buzz, because it's so rare to see trans people in ads. It's still rare to see trans people on television, but in ads even more rare. And another study we did this year, I'm full of data today, but a study that we did this year of brand executives and ad agency executives, so we went right to those execs to ask their thoughts about LGBTQ inclusion. Less than 20% of them said that they were comfortable and knew and knowledgeable about transgender people and could put them in ads. So that's where groups like GLAAD come in, and advocacy organizations. But it's not just groups like GLAAD that can do that consulting. There are also amazing consultants from the transgender community that work with brands behind the scenes, work with Hollywood as well behind the scenes, to make sure that that representation is accurate. And in terms of the possibility too for the trans community, we're living in a year where there have been over 100 anti-trans pieces of legislation introduced. 8 states this year passed bans on transgender youth in sports. And thinking back to that Edelman Trust Barometer, brands are trusted. So if brands are telling stories of some of their trans constituents and stakeholders, that could have real change, and it reaches moms and dads out there who are not watching shows like Pose and are not coming into contact with trans stories. That's the real power that brands can have in terms of changing the game for trans visibility.
Yeah, I think sometimes if you look at gays and lesbians, it can feel like, well, okay, things are pretty good now, the fight's over, but it's not. It's not for all of us, and it's especially not for trans people. I think L's and G's, especially white L's and G's, need to fight harder and louder for visibility, celebration, and protection for trans people and queer people of color who started the riot and movement that we have benefited from.
I do think we'll see a change in this in coming years. Go ahead. Sorry to cut you off.
It's okay. Go ahead. You can finish.
Well, I've been with GLAAD since 2008, and in my early years at GLAAD, I remember when it was very controversial to have 2 gay dads in an ad. And when there was protests actually in 2012 for JCPenney naming Ellen DeGeneres as their spokesperson. Like, can you imagine that today? Ellen wound up stayed with JCPenney, and JCPenney stood by her, and we at GLAAD created an advocacy campaign around that, Stand with Ellen. But I think brands learned really fast that the general public was welcoming and accepting of gay and lesbian cisgender people, and I think more and more you'll see that now. And that the younger generation, Janine mentioned the number of LGBTQ Americans, 1 in 6 members of Gen Z, according to a Gallup poll 2 months ago are part of the LGBT community and say they're part of our community. So I think younger people are expecting to see that gender diversity and trans and non-binary representation.
Yeah.
Mel, did
But
you
I
have
think-
something you wanted to
Yeah,
add?
I think it's important that we start also hiring this population. Like we can't keep telling all these stories if no one in the room is part of the community. And when we have a huge amount of cisgender white men that are controlling this narrative and this story, these are not going to be the top of mind stories. Like they're not going to immediately come up with a transgender or non-binary story. And I think that's the part that we have to really focus on, making a more inclusive, diverse population inside the people that are making these actual ads.
So we have another question from the audience. As advertisers, what can we do to advance and advocate for the LGBTQ plus community and issues? And on the other side of the coin, what are some of the harmful practices that we can avoid? Mel, do you want to start with that one?
I mean, I hate these best practice questions just because there's tons of them, right? I mean, we can go on and on about really rainbow washing and just basically putting a rainbow on your brand but not backing it. Like at this point, they're in 54 states, right? If you are gay, you can still get fired. You can be denied health care. You can be denied being able to go to a homeless shelter. You can get kicked out of your apartment. And when you just rainbow wash something and don't acknowledge the fight that basically in the rest of the country, besides on the coasts, none of the community is protected, especially the people that started this movement in the first place.
I think that's a really good point from Mel. I think one of the things we can do is to encourage and push our clients to take meaningful actions for sexual minorities and queer identities. And this, it's not easy, but it comes from knowing what your queer consumers want and need and responding to those needs. Simple acts of inclusion through product invention, huge. And I think MasterCard's True Name card is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, that's a great case study to think about.
And so I started McCann-Q, and that idea came from us creating a space, like workshopping space, where it was just a queer workshopping space, and those ideas, like we bounced a bunch of ideas off, and that's where the True Name initial idea, like the thought process came. But if we don't create those spaces with inside agencies, if we don't hire these people, these ideas are they won't come to life, right? Because it's not like my dad is not thinking about these things. My community is thinking about it, and respecting that intersectionality is the most important part of this conversation.
Rich, can you actually speak to, does GLAAD have any data? You've come filled with data today, so I'm wondering if GLAAD has any data in terms of actually internal and, within the ad world, like what representation looks like internally.
In terms of employees?
Correct, yeah. Do you have any sort of read on that?
We don't, no. But Sarah mentioned earlier the importance of hiring, and I think that's key. And we talk about consultants, and I think that's a good way to do it, but so much more important to have representation at all levels of ad agencies. And I think that will lead to an improvement in LGBTQ representation. But if you don't have that on staff now, it's so important to make sure you're hiring LGBTQ talent to work on these campaigns as consultants. And it's not just like the brains behind the campaigns, but think about being on set, the makeup artists for a campaign, the directors of a campaign, because queer people can tell queer stories in a lot more of an authentic way than non-queer people. And it's going to lead to better earned media and a better story to tell after. I always say, like, LGBTQ Twitter is a force that you don't want to reckon with. And as a brand that lives on LGBTQ Twitter, our community is really loud, and we are a community that was founded on protest and demands for equality. So if the community is seeing a campaign that's not authentic or doesn't have representation in front of the camera and behind the scenes, they are likely to call it out. That's a big part of rainbow washing today.
We actually got a question about rainbow washing from Julie on Facebook just now. What are the ways you've seen brands actually testing their ads to make sure the brand isn't rainbow washing and truly authentic?
We have a lot of brands who come to us to kind of gauge that in advance, but if you're asking that question, chances are you're already engaging in rainbow washing, because true inclusion and authentic inclusion starts way before the idea for a great pride campaign, an attention grabbing campaign. This Pride Month, we saw really loud cries from the community for brands that were participating in Pride, but had given donations to anti-LGBTQ politicians in recent years. So when we talk about making sure your house is in order, many people look to the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index, which looks at internal policies and making sure that your brand or your company has 100 on that. But it's not enough these days, because now our community is also looking at political giving. I mentioned those anti-trans laws that we're moving forward. So important that brands are not participating in politicians that are trying to work against our equality. A pride campaign is not going to erase that harm and the harms of those bills. And then just a couple of other things that I've seen brands engage in. I've heard from a lot of LGBTQ talent, social talent, or actors and actresses who are asked to promote campaigns, but there's no budget to pay them for their time. So if you're going to be engaging with LGBTQ talent, make sure that you're compensating them for their time. And then I always say approach Pride in a very 365 full year approach. So if you're going to engage in a Pride campaign, also hold a meeting in Pride Month about what you're doing LGBTQ wise in Q4 or around the holidays. And also think about LGBTQ media as a place for ad buys, not just during Pride Month, but year round, because that's the lifeline for our community. They're reporting on issues mainstream media is not, and we need to make sure they're thriving.
And we have a whole session discussing that portion of this a little bit later. Awesome. So that's definitely a great part to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I actually had one more question. How can the queer leaders who have benefited from and grown complacent within the system revitalize their activism themselves and push the industry to actually change? And we can start with you, Sarah, if you'd like.
Sure. I think all leaders need to be better at creating space for people to be really fully expressive in who they are, all of their intersectional identities. I think queer leaders must do that too, but we can also lead by example. We need to really show up and work as our fully authentic selves. I've had moments in my career, admittedly, where I've censored myself and I've thought, oh no, that's way too gay to say. But honestly, that's self-imposed censorship. And so I've really tried to stop doing that and really tried to, again, lead by example and create that space for people to show up as sort of their true, authentic, full selves.
And right on top of that, is there ways that you would promote for leaders to lean on advocacy? Like, how can leaders be advocates? Are there good examples of that?
I just think it's also, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
It's just so important that we are creating, it's not just on leaders, like queer leaders, to create these spaces, right? It also has to be coming from within inside the agency itself. We need to make truly inclusive environments where Sarah doesn't feel like she has to edit herself, and it also hurts the creative. When a creative is worried about, like, am I too flamboyant? Am I too this? Am I too that? And they're not going to be able to actually give you the amazing ideas like True Name, because they don't feel comfortable in these spaces. And that's not necessarily on queer leadership to figure out. That's on the whole company itself to make a more inclusive environment.
Yeah, I think hiring is obviously critically important, but within the agency system, you also have to give diversity and give queer people the microphone.
Before we wrap, I just want to ask each of you, if we were to talk about this again a year from now, what change do you hope to see over the next year? Mel, do you want to start?
I would like to see someone that's not a light-skinned femme representation of the community in my role. So a butch, dark-skinned Black woman. That's what I'd like to see.
Sarah?
I agree with Mel. I would also add that I have noticed a lot of focus in mainstream media on the queer struggle and the hardship associated with the queer experience. And that is true. There is hardship, there is struggle, but there is also tremendous power and love and family. And actually, you know, I think queer people and other marginalized identities have a perspective on the world that the world needs to hear. We have a lot to teach. We have a lot to teach straight people about, and culture at large. Because we've sort of picked up superpowers and honed skills that can help the world at work, in their relationships, and in life. So I would like to see a demonstration of, I think, people learning a little bit more from the queer community.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Mel said about representation and making sure it mirrors the actual LGBTQ space, but talking about it in an external fashion. So making sure that there are, to improve the quality, the quantity, and the diversity of inclusion in external facing ads and public communications for brands. I've spoken about the opportunity and the need for it from our community. There's a business opportunity for brands, but there's also growing demands from our community to do it in an authentic and a real way.
Great. I think we might have lost Janine there, but I think, you know, that was it. That was our last question there. So, you know, thank you so much, Sarah, Mel, and Rich, for joining us. This was a great conversation, and I hope we can have you guys again. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for hosting us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, there you are.
I'm back. So thank you all three for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So before we get moving on, thank you to those who are watching at home. We have Isaac, Selena, Alan, Nassif, Mariana, Kathy, Miranda, and Terry. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, leave them on our social channels and we will try to get to them during this broadcast.
And we'll be shifting the conversation a little bit to ad dollars in LGBTQ-owned media. There's been a call to action over the past year for brands to allocate more of their ad dollars to minority-owned media companies. Next, we will discuss how LGBTQ-owned media companies have been prioritizing these efforts and how brands can better partner with these companies for more authentic sponsorships. We're joined by Michael Kelly, co-owner and board chair of Equal Entertainment, Damian Pelliccioni, CEO and co-founder of Reverie, and Rachel Lowenstein, partner and director of Invention Plus of Mindshare.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
Hello. Hi there.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
So during this year's upfront deal making, when media companies were looking to secure a bulk of their ad commitments for the fall season, we've seen more attention paid to media outlets that reach more diverse audiences. And I'm curious, how have LGBTQ-owned media companies fit into this? And are they being prioritized in the same way as some of the broader D&I commitments that are being made by brands and agencies? Maybe Michael, you can kick us off on this. I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Oh, you know, Janine, you and I have had a lot of conversations about that. So the answer is no. The very simple answer is we have not had the level of representation in the upfront. And I would think year-round planning, I think it was said earlier that, you know, June tends to be that Pride month that everyone focuses on. But the real opportunity is to expand, especially if you have a sizable target audience in the LGBTQ space, is to really make it year round. I think you said it earlier about 365. And that consistency is, if there was anything I would suggest to brands, is maybe even spend less, but do it consistently 365 year after year. There are so many brands, I could probably rattle off all the brands, and so could the other panelists, that have disenfranchised the LGBTQ community. You know, ones like Chick-fil-A, Home Depot, and others. There's not a long list of at least brands that I could point to that have consistently invested in this community. And when you start investing in the community and you show real commitment, the love that you'll get would counteract any cancel culture we get blamed for, to be honest with you. And I think increasingly we're we're starting to see brands recognize, I've got to make this commitment. I can't just come in 1 year, go out for 3, come in another, come out again. We've got to be focused. So if there's any message, it's, start with Upfront, but really make it part of your full year campaign.
Yeah, and I do want to call out, we did a story today that was specifically looking at how diversity played a role in the upfront. And really what we found was most of the conversation was around BIPOC-owned media companies. So, to Michael, to your point, we did not hear a lot around, other types of groups, especially LGBTQ. So, to your point of the attention being paid during the upfronts, and then even in the broader long-term commitments, it's not something we've heard a lot of over the past couple of months.
Correct. Yeah, Jamie, I was going to say also too, I think it's sad in a way that some of the marginalized communities like the Black community with Byron Allen have had to file a lawsuit. You've written a lot about this in order to get attention. And in fact, I was on a 2022 RFP with a major brand that you would recognize. And we asked about their plans for LGBTQ, and we were told TBD. Now, I can tell you, if other marginalized communities heard that, they would be in your newspaper. They would be in your magazine. They would be in your websites. That's something that, frankly, we've got to move to a level of, among all of us, Damien and others, of not accepted. We need to have a seat at the table equal to the other communities if we are an equal target market.
I'm going to step in real quick because I somewhat agree with Michael, but I also disagree with Michael. For instance, right now, what you're looking at, this is a campaign that we did with McDonald's. They underwrote an entire 90-minute variety show. It was the first time McDonald's stepped into underwriting original content for our community. They stepped in a big way. We ended up doing 15 million impressions in just 30 days, and now they're committing to us for 365 days a year. There are brands out there like Lexus who've invested in our community for years, even well before Reverie. And there are ones that are now stepping in editorially. We have this conversation always about, pink washing and rainbow washing. I don't see that as a negative. I see that as a positive. It's creating a marketplace and an opportunity through editorial moments like Pride to show ROI. Example, McDonald's, they saw the opportunity and the cost, and they came in a big way, and now they're supporting us all year round.
Yeah, I think both things can be true of what Damien and Michael are both saying. From the agency side, I think Michael brings up some very important points, which is that queer media hasn't been given its diligence from an investment standpoint. I do think we're seeing the tide starting to shift, even in incremental ways. I think one frustration, and it's almost become this kind of provocation that we're running with as an agency now, is that we've seen for so long brands really attaching themselves to queer representation and creative, which is obviously incredibly important to see ourselves represented in creative ways. That being said, I always have felt like we've ignored the media impact of representation and investment. And I think we're starting to see some more incremental changes to what we're calling intentionally investing in queer media to match the energy that we've seen from brands and creative representation to better economically fund queer communities. I think Michael's correct that we still have a long way to go. One kind of thing that we're undertaking as an agency is we've created an intentional media approach to better align brand values to how they behave in media. And that does mean investing in queer media. It means investing in diverse media. It means matching what you say you believe in and how you're spending your ad dollars. So I do think there's some incrementality that needs to be still done. And I love what Damien said about rainbow washing and pink washing. Like, that is powerful. It is powerful for us to think about how we can use the things that have been weaponized against us and make it work for our community, which I think is a really interesting perspective.
Well, also starting with the community. I mean, there are examples, and Damien, I applaud what McDonald's is doing with you. I'm thrilled to hear they're going 365 with you. That's what we're pushing with Equal on our Pride platforms. But I will tell you this, June just left us, and we saw a number of major brands use non-LGBTQ owned media for their Pride campaigns. And if you went on and looked at the social commentary, and the conservative right is very organized in pouncing and frankly calling a lot of negative commentary and creating an unsafe brand environment with those. And you have, as a brand, you have to say, well, wait a minute, all this social commentary is negative about my Pride campaign on this non-LGBTQ owned platform. Am I going to be really, really strong and courageous like McDonald's and weather it and say, too bad? That's how we're going to move, and keep it up, Damien. This is up to you, consistently, year after year. Or are you going to succumb to it? And listen, we all know, Rachel knows this better than I do. I was a former CMO. The minute you see any kind of negative response, they pull back. And brands either have to dive in with it first and then expand. Start from the inside out, not the outside in.
So let's talk about actually going back to the question. Brands should be supporting minority founders, right? Reverie, great example. We're founded by 2 women of color, Aaliyah J. Daniels, LaShawn McGee, LaShawn being queer, Aaliyah an ally, LaShawn being a veteran. We also have another POC founder, Chris Rodriguez, who's Latinx. I myself am non-binary and an immigrant from Canada. I always say, I don't know if that counts for anything. But the big thing is brands are looking to invest in minority founded and minority owned and operated queer media brands like Reverie. Because we won't have the same negative connotation that someone like, Michael, you were just relating to, a mainstream brand just jumping into Pride without having that level of authenticity behind it in their leadership and their founding team. And I think that is where, in the market at least, Reverie is really winning out, because they're investing really in our leadership as well as the ROI that we can provide through our CTV and our OTT channels.
One thing to just add to that, first and foremost, brands should be prioritizing their spend in queer media first around queer spaces and by and for the community. I do think there is something to be said, potentially in a more secondary or even tertiary way, which is that investing in more broad media that covers queer rights in a positive way does shift the narrative in mainstream culture outside of queer spaces and places. So I do think there's a balance that brands have to reckon with, where they're shifting their dollars more to prioritize queer owned and run media. But I do think there is a place and a space for partners who cover queer rights and queer advocacy in a positive way without doing harm to the community, which honestly just opens up a whole conversation about brand safety and why brand safety largely and historically and obviously unintentionally has harmed the queer community and many other communities.
So let's talk about brand safety, because I have a lot of thoughts on this as well. Being the largest LGBTQ CTV provider in the world, we had a lot of issues when we were going internationally, in places and partners like with Samsung, for instance. Most of what we call brand safe here in the United States is not necessarily brand safe overseas. So we had to realize anything that was in our AVOD channels or our FAST channels, free ad supported streaming TV, we had to not censor, but we had to create a TV PG version of that. But the difference was, once we got into the space, with our brand safe content, it did not hinder the opportunity for allies to watch our content. It actually created opportunity because it expanded the reach into majority non-ally audiences. Actually, Reverie predominantly reaches a non-allied audience, not an LGBTQ specific one, 24/7. And because of that, we've been able to grow now into multiple markets. Samsung's a great example, one of our biggest partners. We launched with them in the UK, in Australia, in Brazil, in Mexico. We're launching very soon in Canada. But had it not been taking that first step, following the rules, and then creating space and taking up space in that EPG, we wouldn't have the level of success that we have today. So, and then the other side of this, though, too, is that, and I have full respect for, not-for-profits like GLAAD and the work that they do, but some of the data that they put out is detrimental to the community because it only is specific to scripted content. And the bulk of where our community is watching and our non-allied communities are watching are non-scripted shows like HBO Max's Legendary or VH1's RuPaul's Drag Race, which have a much broader reach and a bigger audience than scripted shows, unfortunately, like Pose, which I love. It's one of my favorite shows. It just doesn't reach that broader audience. And so we have to be very careful, and we have to also have brands look at us not just as charity, but as an opportunity to create something much bigger. was a study done by Forbes in 2018 that minority founded business will gross 30 to 40% higher margins than cisgender white male specifically companies. And that is because we work 10 times harder to get that dollar in the door, and we'll end up giving you a longer and more powerful return on that investment. But it's like Michael and Rachel were saying, it's taking that first plunge, taking the step, and it really revolves around data, showing the success, and evangelizing that to all the different brands and agencies.
And we're definitely going to get to the measurement aspect, I think, a little later on in this conversation. But, you know, as you're talking about brand safety and why it's important to go to owned networks for this reason, Damien, maybe you can talk a little bit how your channels are reaching these audiences in a different or more nuanced ways than other media brands that also reach the community but are more general entertainment.
So we are focused on the OTT and CTV and FAST market. FAST standing means free ad-supported streaming TV. So if you have a Vizio TV like this one, you immediately have access to over 160 channels, Reverie being the exclusive and only LGBTQ network. Same thing on Samsung connected TVs, LG connected TVs, Zumos, all these new FAST and AVOD platforms where it's free in front of the paywall. Are reaching bigger, wider, massive audiences. It's essentially the cable killer in a way, because you won't have to pay a subscription fee to a package of these live channels. It'll come baked into your television. So we have been not just a market leader in LGBTQ media, but we've also been kind of a pioneer in the space of AVOD and CTV. And we're using that to evangelize the opportunity to show the ROI to the different brands and show that technology, specifically in the millennial and Gen Z space, is not necessarily just on a desktop.
Amen. I think what we also need, and Damien needs this as I do, as much as a general investor, we need the advertisers investing in us to grow. I'm impressed with Damien's international growth, but we're diminishing as a voice. Let me put it out there. Despite the great successes of us reaching 14 million LGBTQ a month and Damien's growing, the voices are diminishing, and we are seeing a rise in hate crimes. We're seeing a rise in suicides. We're seeing a rise in lack of help to people. And I don't mean to say that that's our mission, but when people don't see themselves identified, they don't see themselves represented, and they don't hear a voice, it's a lot of despair. And I think it's up to Rachel and the agencies and the brands and others to go to both owned media, but also mainstream media, because I can tell you right now, and you can go ask any of your clients, Rachel, in the studios, do they have LGBTQ focused production efforts? Do they have LGBTQ aimed content? And the answer is no. It's universally not there. So together we need to work, and we're not, and I think Damien's saying that, I hope, is just, we're not discounting mainstream media, but we want to work together. In fact, I'm working on a project right now where I'm working with a major brand. We're going to produce it. It's going to run on our Pride Media and Equal Entertainment platforms. And then they're going to run it across other mainstream media. That's actually a really beautiful, harmonious way to work together.
I completely agree, Michael. I think, you know, agencies, brands, we have a responsibility to supporting the communities, the queer community in particular today, that, you know, brands have used in their creative and wanted to profit from. And there is massive both social profit in investing in queer media, and there's also financial and business profit. And I think brands really need to understand that the two of those aren't mutually exclusive concepts. Investing in social communities is investing in your business. And I wish and hope brands who are watching this can see the value in that. Because, you know, bringing up the point about queer media dying, that's absolutely true. You look at how algorithmic bias and brand safety has systemically defunded and harmed the queer community, the Black community, because of this lack of nuance in how we approach brand safety technology. It's done real harm to many, many publishers. And I think, you know, we're starting to see, again, incremental changes, but we need to make bigger changes. We need to be more bold. We need to be more provocative and see the value in queer media, both from a social level and from a business level.
Yeah, look, I mean, social media has been problematic. We stopped spending any marketing dollars on Facebook and YouTube like years ago, actually not a year ago, because we weren't seeing the same ROI that we are when we spend on our CTV networks. All of our marketing dollars go to the places that our channels live, and we do a 3 to 4x return on those dollars. And we're targeting people who are not necessarily part of the community and creating, again, more space and conversation, opening up representation into new markets and new technologies and new platforms outside of your traditional social media and desktop platforms. And that is where the change, I believe, is really happening. And that's where the younger generations, and it's generational, really live. You know, when we look at millennials, it's 1 in 6 identify as LGBTQ. When we look at Gen Z, it's 52% that do not declare their gender or their sexual orientation, falling somewhere on the spectrum. Hence why we use, even from a marketing perspective, just the word queer. Queer encompasses a broader community that allows our allies to be part of the conversation and the fight that we're having here. And so we want that. We want to create more space by creating more representation and content and meeting the audience where they live, which is on all of these new technologies.
And the stats that were quoted on that, like 15 million who identify as LGBTQ, that's way understating what we have in America. We have to, if you look at a recent study, we think it's more closer to 35 million, not even counting the non-conforming that, queer representation that Damien just brought up. So, I'd venture to say we're closer to 50 or 60 million. And when you start to hear numbers like that, you got to start taking, and by the way, we're 1 trillion in spend in the US. Okay, we're equal to a lot of other communities that just on a sheer consumer basis, we need to be paid attention to. So I'd like, Janine, maybe we need to talk about doing a bolder study on true numbers of consumers in this market.
Would love to.
Nielsen actually published a wonderful study about representation and the opportunity for LGBTQ recently this Pride season. And it really gave some great statistics, and it was only focused obviously on the OTT CTV market, but it shows the growing opportunity in these new technologies.
And Michael, I'm just curious, historically, what have been the challenges in attracting ad dollars?
Scale. We've always been compared to mainstream media. I know Damien and I have talked about this over some of our lunches and stuff. Is you go into an RFP, everybody has a hell of a lot of energy towards you. And by the way, you're giving up authentic ideas and we don't have a lot of time. We're underrepresented. Okay, that means understaffed, underinvested, so all these things, right, lead up. And then we're told, well, you just don't have the scale in the market. And you're like, well, wait a minute. How does this work if you're really going to gear, effort towards that? So I think we're starting to see changes, I will say, and the value that is placed on our market is growing. I'm commanding rates, frankly, I know Damien is, that are much, much higher than mainstream media, even reaching this market. And by the way, my company, no other brands can tell with any other platform, including Carolyn Everson told me this about Facebook. They cannot identify at Facebook without a lot of data exhaust who's LGBTQ. I have it. So why Damien has it? So, to a degree, why are we sitting here, speculating on something that's not real?
Are you talking about it related to targeting, like ad targeting and data around like consumers?
Yes, I'm talking about, the delivery of this market, pure and simple. And it's very difficult.
So we're servicing at scale now. We're hitting 280 million homes, and our average free user watches 1 hour and 28 minutes per day of content, which means if we have the rule of thumb of 8 minutes per ad, our average user watches 12 ad units per day. So we can service now at scale because we've hit all these major markets. Reverie is being seen as a mainstream network now. And so we're able to walk into the room and service any level of impressions or buy that any agency or brand wants. The difference is getting into the room. This is kind of what Michael and I have always talked about before, and getting in front of the right decision makers and the people on the investment side. We're still a new brand. We've only been around for 5.5 years now. We just celebrated our 5 years consumer facing at the end of June. But I think the difference is that when you're hitting such a massive market, the other thing, we're not even filling or selling all the inventory ourselves. We have 35 SSPs in our ad stack where we fill all of our remnant inventory, both domestically and abroad. I'd like to know any other media publisher that's in the LGBTQ space that works at that many SSPs. We don't even have time to talk to them because even Rachel just hit me up and let's, someone from Mindshare was like, hey, let's get a catch up very soon.
Rachel, I want you to jump in here. I think you had something to say, but also maybe you could talk a little bit about what Mindshare is doing around the whole programmatic marketplace and talk about that in terms of diversity and inclusion, and specifically for the LGBTQ plus marketplace?
Definitely. I think I'll just round out what Damien and Michael were talking about, just to say that I think brands need to stop being so beholden to reach and start thinking more about relevancy. Today, queer culture is pop culture, and that's obviously been influenced in a number of ways for several decades, especially from queer communities of color. So if brands really want to be relevant in culture, the queer community is where you need to start, and that's where you need to invest. And if you think about some of the fastest growing brands today, especially in the D2C space, they aren't thinking about reach first. They're thinking about the ways that they can be most relevant to the right types of communities. So again, if brands want to be relevant in culture, queer culture is it. So as it relates to the question around programmatic and what we're doing there, a couple of years ago, we launched something called the Inclusion Private Marketplaces. The purpose of those are twofold. One, simply to have brands better align with different communities. We launched first with the LGBTQ community, and we have another inclusion PMP for the Black community. We also launched those out of a both frustration and a provocation that both through, again, algorithmic bias and brand safety technology and human bias, that queer media was being defunded systemically. And we weren't seeing the intentionality that brands have in their creative really, again, matching how they behave in media. So we launched the LGBTQ PMP with our partner Sky Vodka about a year and a half ago. The results that we've seen are incredible for them. It's now part of their overall media mix and a core part of their branding and their campaign. Sky has obviously been a really vocal and committed advocate for our community for a long time. And we wanted to make sure that they were a part of reversing the issue that's happening where LGBTQ stories and LGBTQ voices are being defunded. And we've had a number of other brands sign on and be a part of the inclusion PMPs. That being said, that's just one thing that we're doing. That can't be the be all end all. Programmatic advertising is not how we're going to save queer media and ensure that it's funded in the long run. So we're starting to think more about intentionality across the media ecosystem outside of programmatic.
Yeah, we got a bunch of questions around measurement and the like. So maybe Rachel, you can continue with what are some of the challenges you foresee organizations having when it comes to measurement of queer initiatives from a media standpoint.
Full disclosure, I'm not a measurement expert, so I'll do my best to answer this and in the best way that I can. I think, brands obviously need to be mindful of data safety and data privacy and the types of questions that they might be fielding in surveys, which is something that I don't think will be an issue that will go away anytime soon. One way that we're thinking about measurement specifically is by using our NeuroLab. Our NeuroLab are a team of neuroscientists who are far smarter than I am, and they run studies to look at memory encoding, emotional intensity, cognitive resonance, all of those kind of consumer and behavioral neuroscience insights. And we're using the NeuroLab to actually understand better emotional connections that brands can forge with consumers. As just one example, with our inclusion PMPs, we saw lifts in memory encoding and emotional intensity when brands advertise in queer media versus heteronormative media. So I think that's one way brands can think about it and looking at the more behavioral and cognitive impact on queer consumers. But I'm sure Michael and Damien might have some other insights from the publisher angle.
I have a very simple way to put it. You show us love, we'll show you love. You show us hate, the grocery store strewn with brands who've done that. I don't need to go through that, but that's in very simple form. If you show commitment consistently, again, it doesn't have to be a lot of money, it doesn't have to be a lot of effort, and I think Damien would agree authentically, you're going to have an embrace that's lifelong, period.
Yeah, I completely agree with both sides. It's interesting because I'm geeking out on kind of the neuroscience behind all the different devices. Like we're starting to collect data from Samsung and Apple in a higher way because I wear my watch, I have my MacBook Pro, I've got my phone. It knows when I have an emotional response to anything, and it's also listening to everything I'm doing to target me better ad campaigns. Same thing with Samsung. Samsung's done a tremendous job. We just sold our house. My partner and I were walking through an open house, and we saw one of these new refrigerators with a giant Samsung refrigerator with a giant screen on it. If you're watching the TV in one room and you walk past the refrigerator, it immediately picks up and left off where you're watching on your TV Plus channel. It was mind blowing. I was like, this is insane how connected these devices are. But this is how we're going to get more granular with the data and how we're going to serve and target better campaigns through these different technologies. But at the end of the day, we're following IAB rules. We have all of our data flowing through our ad server, SpringServe, which gets pretty granular. But just like everybody else, when you're dealing with the publisher side, we're using Google Analytics, just like everybody else.
I really hope you bought that house. So
I have a bid on it. I have to
Good
do a
luck on
counter
that.
after
That's
this. It was the coolest refrigerator I've ever seen. I was like, oh my gosh.
Before we wrap up, I do want to talk and touch upon intersectionality, and maybe Rachel, you can talk about how brands can think a little bit more about how they partner with their own media to better understand intersectional groups.
I think the queer community by nature is incredibly diverse, right? There are so many aspects to being queer. For example, I'm autistic, and being autistic very much informs my queer identity. So I think brands should start looking at the diversity of the LGBTQ community as an opportunity to have more intersectional impact with different communities, whether that's the BIPOC community, the disabled community, whatever it is, because we by nature are a diverse set of individuals who don't have one set of beliefs or one lived experience. And by investing in queer media, you're having more intersectional impact with the types of consumers that you're talking to.
Great.
Like,
Michael.
I agree. Go ahead.
Yeah, Damien.
No, go ahead, Michael.
No, I was just going to say, well said.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the biggest thing is, we're not one race, we're not one gender, we're not one sexual orientation, we're not one language, we're not, the biggest thing is what brands should be investing in is creating the culture of queer. That's what Reverie is. That's the content that we create. That's the content that we curate, that we license, that we develop. It's not just for one sector. It's not one for one section. Like, for instance, I'm using House of Pride here in the background. This is a drag king, Cubano drag king, androgen from Miami, who we flew in to be in this. But we also had Laganja Estranja, who recently came out as trans. We had the House of Balmain. We had Manila Luzon. We had so many different identities represented in this variety show. And that's why I think we did so well in terms of the numbers and the reach and the opportunity, because we weren't just creating something for gay men, for lesbians, or transgender people. It was about the totality of the culture.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect place to leave this. Thank you, Rachel, Michael, and Damien. We appreciate you being here, and hopefully we can continue this conversation offline.
We look forward
Thanks
to
for
it.
having us.
Thank you so much.
So for our final conversation, we are going to turn our focus to the ways the ad world can make the creative process more inclusive and how brands should be thinking about extending their Pride Month campaigns. And for this conversation, we are joined by Lucas Krigler, who's Associate Creative Director at McCann, and Michael Wilkie, founder of Commercial Closet Association, which is now adrespect.org.
Thank you for having us.
Hi.
Hey, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining
Good
us.
afternoon.
Afternoon, yeah. Last month was Pride Month, which saw a multitude of brands create content in support of the LGBTQ plus community. What did you make of last year's efforts? And Lucas, we can start with you on this. Can you provide some insight into where they succeeded and where they fell short?
Sure. I mean, to start with, I think that Pride being only done in a short window of June, and brands only marketing to us within that window, needs to change. So I'll just start with that. But, there were a few brands that I think did it pretty well this year. There's always room to grow, but I love the Miller Lite campaign that is actually taking it upon themselves to go to bars and help actually change the way that majority straight bars are handling LGBTQ communities and being more acceptive and inclusive of them. I think that that's a great initiative for all brands to kind of consider. I also think that, Reebok did it pretty well with showing, I think brands across the board should really lean into having the LGBTQ community speak for themselves. You know, we've got stories to tell. So try not to speak for us. And, you know, Reebok did that pretty well with championing the ballroom scene. Excuse me, the ballroom scene. It was pretty powerful and a beautiful campaign. But, you know, it's again, it should extend beyond June. And I think that brands can do better and that across the board.
Yeah, maybe you can elaborate on that, Lucas. I think that that's probably, if we were talk about shortcomings and where anything fell short, it's probably more so that they're not all year round versus what's done specifically in June. Can you talk about what brands need to do to extend their Pride messaging throughout the year?
I think we should just be treated as normal people. You know, I'm a transgender male, and you know, I identify like that, but I have a lot more to me than just being trans. You know, I'm a consumer just like any other normal person. You know, I live a life. I spend money on toilet paper. You know, that's a very small part of my identity. So, you know, it's great to have a month dedicated to us, but at the same time, you know, past that, I'm still buying products and using services. So I just think that, you know, just including us in all sorts of advertising that maybe might not even be centric to, you know, our identities.
Yeah, you know, that's a good point. You know, we actually have a question from the audience. Recently, this is a quote from the audience. Recently, my LGBTQ friends have commented that they are tired of brands showing ads with stereotypical LGBTQ people. How can brands connect with them as people without highlighting stereotypical LGBTQ people in the ads in 15 or 30 seconds? And Michael, I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks. I'd say, you know, mainstream advertisers today aren't really, I haven't seen as much of a problem with stereotypes as there used to be. I've been doing this for, I think, 20 years now. And my work has been focused on driving advertisers away from just that problem. I also think that a lot of advertisers are way past the 30-second ad, and 15s are very rare. What is happening so much in recent years is a focus on longer form ads online that are 1 minute and 30 or several minutes long, almost mini movies. And, you know, that gives them a lot more time to tell a story and not focus too much on a bing, bing, bing kind of format of diversity and, you know, vignettes of you know, very short pictures. But, you know, among my best practices on what advertisers can do is to try as much as possible to feature real LGBTQ identified talent, show them as couples and families and all of the, you know, the diversity that we represent, which was just being spoken in the last panel. You know, we represent every race and culture and ethnicity and socioeconomic status and age and lifestyle and so on. You know, we're parents and surfers and bankers and nerds, among other things. So, you know, we're not just all, you know, gay white males who identify that way and you know, we're not all designers kind of thing. Black Lives Matter, I would say, also has had a huge impact this past year in my tracking on representation in ads in general, but particularly on this very point of moving away from the gay white male phenomenon that advertisers have overly focused on for a long time. You know, we did a really good job, I'd say, in previous 20 years of selling advertisers on the wealth of the gay male, the gay white male, and that's what dominated advertising for a really long time. And I'd say last year was transformative, and my focus in particular is on mainstream ads that are inclusive of our community rather than just ads that target our dollars in our own media channels. So with that in mind, you know, just seeing the transformation has been really rewarding, that advertisers have gotten the message on that.
How so? Is that in terms of representation, in terms of who is being represented in these campaigns? Is it who's creating the campaigns? Like, what has changed?
Well, I think what's changed is awareness. I think the Black Lives Matter movement really woke a lot of ad agencies up. I mean, it's been a problem forever and a day to bring in the diversity needed on the other side of the camera. And ad agencies are still working on that and have more to do for sure with regards to people of color, gender, and of course, sexuality and orientation.
Lucas, how do you have conversations with clients about creating authentic and, truly representative depictions of the queer community and media? And how do you correct them when they could be doing better?
I think that the easiest answer there is to just have us in the room. Take us in there with you, lean into us. If you don't have that, try to outsource to a LGBTQ diversity, and inclusion group that will help guide you and vet your ideas and give you true insights. And then take those to the client and show them, proof of concept through our own stories that we're telling. And if you have a little bit more of a conservative type client, I would say speak their language first. It only takes a crack in the door to bust it down. So, I love a great brief that has a very strong strategy behind it. Bring some of that data and some of that, qualitative, quantitative data in there. I know Mike was saying, we are big spenders. I think that the LGBT community has a total of like $3.7 trillion in purchasing power. But again, that might be your way in, but then that will allow the crack in the door to be, blasted through. And we can start there and then little by little start to push the agenda there to be a little bit more positive.
I would add, I think that one of the challenges that has been in place for a long time is the focus group of one problem. So while I believe it's really important to have someone in the agency in the room who represents the target audience or the diversity that is sought, I think focus groups are still and always important to remember to include, ideally before as well as after the ad is created, and get a sense of, did we get it right? Is the authenticity there, or what's missing? I recognize that research takes time and money, but at the expense of doing it wrong, lots of campaigns in the past have been pulled after they aired on the Super Bowl, among other places, and then you've spent $1 bazillion to go have everything go wrong.
Yeah, for TrueName, we actually did it ourselves. We went down to Pride and we surveyed we took our little film crew and surveyed, transgender people and non-binary people to get their viewpoints and to kind of show testament that we were on the right track. And we took that specifically to the client and then, really got their excitement and engagement into our idea. So, whatever means you can bring us in.
I'd like the chance to also answer the first question, if I may, in thinking about, what happened in this past year or past month. Now, I'm not a big fan of Pride Month stuff. I think these days it's really full of rainbow washing. It's a real problem. If you open your LinkedIn, and you would have seen dozens of companies that, rainbow-fied their logos. And a walk through Target is amazing at how many products would have a rainbow on them, in June. And I greet it with really mixed feelings. Like, part of me is happy to see that there's this much awareness going on at the corporate level. And at the same time, I feel like it's not enough. It's somewhat empty, because just because I see the logo or I see the trade dress, the product has a rainbow on it for a month, it's not enough. You have to do so much more. The bar's been raised. It was not that long ago that all you needed to do was put an ad in LGBT media, and then you're done. And Absolute Vodka became a legend for doing that. They really never did much more than advertise, for LGBT media, and they barely even put a rainbow on their ads at that. They were early, so they got a lot of credit, and I'm not trying to diss them, but I think the bar has been raised substantially. And today you've got to do so much more. You have to really have an integrated campaign year round. And it means, more than just product packaging at Pride. It means presence also at Pride events. It means supporting LGBT organizations throughout the year, having partnerships, and also not doing the wrong things like supporting anti-LGBT politicians or organizations, and also doing the right thing internally, making sure your LGBT employees are getting equal treatment and not being left behind. So there's so much more that companies need to do than just an ad or just putting a rainbow on their product. Now, for this past year, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, absolutely. I think brand actions speak way louder than just rainbow washing and throwing a rainbow on something. I think, we've been talking about this forever, but also it's like, I would say, try to go into places that maybe might not be marketing. Like, I don't necessarily want to see it, which means that you're probably in the right direction. Market to targets that need to see the message too. You know what I mean? It doesn't just have to be geared and put in places where there's a lot of LGBTQ people. It can extend out of that. It can go, go down into Alabama and do something. You know what I mean? And that's where it really is going to make a difference.
I'd say Black Lives Matter also has raised the bar on this, the expectation that companies do more than just put people in an ad, that they need to be good corporate citizens, and that when states are facing, issues that affect Black lives or LGBT lives, that they need to step up. And we saw that in North Carolina with the bathrooms bill. We've seen it in multiple states now for voters registration. And so companies need to show that they can do a lot more than just ask for our money. I'd say, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike, you can continue.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to get, I took a look back at the ads from the past year so far, and wanted to call out some things that I thought did a great job. One that just came out for the NFL that said football is gay, and went through a whole list of what football is to be inclusive, and mentioned their partnership with Trevor Project. I thought that was a great example. Particularly now that breaking through is so much harder today to get attention if you are seeking the LGBT community. And not all advertisers are. At this point, a lot of times it's just about showing the reality of life, and that we are part of everyday life. We're not just the target audience anymore. And not for nothing, and your last panel notwithstanding, LGBT media is very few and far between. As an advertiser, it's really hard to speak directly to this community in our media, because media in general has been under fire, newspapers and websites even. So mainstream ads are now, I think, the best way to speak to an LGBT audience, but also, generations today don't see a big deal out of this. It's the way of the future for advertisers in general. So beyond that, there's a lot of not surprisingly, tech companies doing a great job. Amazon, Google, and Facebook groups, they've been doing ads that are inclusive. Procter & Gamble, one of the biggest of all time, has done some great stuff recently for Tide. There's a lesbian couple of parents sorting laundry together. It's so ho-hum. It's amazing to see. But, showing our families, gay and lesbian men and women as parents is something that has really started to happen a lot in recent years, and I applaud that. Diversity in age is not something that we're seeing a lot of, but Chevy for Bolt did a commercial in partnership with Disney World that actually showed an older gay male couple as well as a non-binary teen separately as part of their vignettes, which I thought was something that stood out. And one of my best practices, as I've said earlier, is to show real people, real LGBT people. So we've seen that from Airbnb, from Facebook, from Google, on the Super Bowl, no less. They did a life in a day from around the world and included a trans woman and a lesbian couple. Citi has done a number of ads. They did a comparative product to MasterCard's true name that was a great ad. They've also featured Dan Levy in their ads. Actually, Dan Levy's pretty hot right now. He's been in M&M and Citibank and Frito-Lay with Kate McKinnon, doing all sorts of ads everywhere. Lil Nas X for Defy Logic, which was on the Super Bowl. RuPaul, of course, has done a lot of ads over the years and did Old Navy most recently. And trans people have been showing up in ads, not just for Citi and MasterCard under those true name approaches, which is a perfect product for such a message. But we've also seen it for Gillette, and we've seen it for Pantene. So a lot of really big advertisers have also gone the way of being inclusive for trans consumers as well.
And before we continue, just a reminder for those of you watching at home, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on our social channels. We'll try to get to those during this conversation. I do want to circle back to, Mike, one of the points that you made and you touched upon was age. And we did have a question come in from the audience. It appears that most LGBTQ plus advertising focuses on youth. So maybe Lucas, can you talk a little bit of what are your thoughts about creating a more diverse view of our already diverse target?
Oh, I think that's absolutely crucial. Like I said earlier, you know, our sexuality and gender identity is just a very small part of who we are in our day-to-day lives. And you know, obviously, also intersectionality also includes not just race but age. And I think that a lot of marketing these days is really geared toward the younger generation, you know, especially with like social media and influencers being a big part of it. But, you know, including the older, I'm turning 40 in August, so I'm getting up there as well. And I don't want to see myself excluded.
You don't look it.
But I will say, you know, I won't tell you like how my girlfriend is. My girlfriend is also a trans woman who passes as a female and has been in this industry. She's an actress, a SAG actress, and it's interesting because, well, I'll get back to that in a minute. But you know, us getting older, it's important to see ourselves in these ads because we don't want to be completely obsolete. And also, our views are different than younger generations. You know, across the board, I know that I think the last panel touched on this, but we're diverse within diversity, you know, so it's important to kind of tap in, just as any generation would have different viewpoints and you know, purchasing habits. It's important to really tap into those and speak to us on a personal level.
And you know, I think you both, you know, touched upon it in terms of authenticity and representation. You know, Michael, we could start with you on this. How can we avoid tokenism when diversifying marketing campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a problem in advertising. It's omnipresent, as we were just saying. You know, true diversity really has to escape the simplicity that we've been taking to that approach. You know, a lot of ads that are trying to be diverse just has, you know, a person of color, or a few persons of color, and they're done. And now we can't just be a person of color, an LGBT person, and we're done. It has to be really overlapping. You know, as we said already, you know, LGBT people come from every style of life and every age and every you know, background. We need to include that. We need to use that as part of our approach. And I think by using real LGBTQ people, that really is one way to accomplish that. We don't have to always do it that way, but it definitely is one of my best practices. And really, then you start to get, you know, what used to be called twofers and threefers, where, you know, you've got somebody who hits multiple levels of diversity that you might be trying to hit.
Right. Yeah. I think it casts a wider net. You know, I think that and the approval rating. I think P&G did a study that's like the more it's becoming more and more accepted. Like 68% said that of 2,000 Americans that they surveyed, I have numbers, said that you know, they were more likely to buy products from brands that show LGBTQ people, because I think that if you're doing that, you're casting a wider net and you're showing that you are accepting across the board. You know, and you're able to actually hit a lot more, especially through the intersectionality. You're able to hit a lot more markets, and also, I know that if you do this, you could be up against, getting back to the clients, like you could be up against a little bit of, ruffle some feathers. But think about the last time that you wrote like a Yelp review or called a customer service line to talk to them. You're usually complaining. The people that are really enjoying it and liking it usually are the quietest. The ones that make the most stink are the ones that are it's a very small percentage of people that actually would disagree, with that, including us.
Just ask the 1 million moms. 1 million.
Well, thanks to both of you. I appreciate both to Lucas and Mike for being here and your insightful answers. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you to all the panelists who took the time to really thoughtfully and passionately answer these questions. We very much appreciate you being here. Thank you to those who are watching and who submitted and sent in some questions. Please keep them coming and keep an eye on adage.com for more coverage. Thanks, Brian, for joining me today. And a special thank you to our Ad Age crew, Alfred Mascaroni, Anna Sakula, and Arabella Breck for making this live stream happen. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.